is a physical parallel to Shabbat in a way, to step back and to recharge. But it is not recharging in and of itself, as if that were a sole good or a highest good. It's because the recharging that happens on Shabbat, when traditionally we don't create, we don't change, we don't destroy, is not for its own sake, but so that we actually go back into the world. And L'Taken Olam B'Malchut Shaddai, we really try and create a better world for everybody. And that seemed an appropriate, but also strange framing for today, which is a very, very, very strange and difficult moment for America and for the world. And at the same time, it's why I'm so grateful and honored to welcome today Rabbi Jill Jacobs and Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein. Rabbi Jacobs has led Trua for many years. She's been in the Forward 50. She's been in the network group of top 50 rabbis. But truthfully, I say Chazon is part of the Social Justice Roundtable with Trua, and we've crisscrossed with Jill and Trua over the years. Jill is somebody who walks the walk in terms of being Jewishly grounded, engaged with the world, holding different challenges, and somehow trying to help us as a community thread through. Isaiah is Chazon's rabbi in residence. We first met you at Isabella Friedman, where you have simultaneously been somebody who on the one hand can like play guitar and like have a niggun and be a Rebbe in that sense. And yet at the same time, you are also African-American. You've been one of the key leaders in this generation in challenging and encouraging the Jewish community to really step forwards. And so I'm honored to have you both here today. And I think I just want to begin by asking each of you, to just say a couple of sentences about your own background, just briefly, how you get to be rabbis, how you get to be you. And then also just a sentence about how you're feeling at the moment. Jill, you're up.
Hi, thank you so much to Nigel and to the whole Chazon team for welcoming me. It's really nice to get to see Isaiah. I miss seeing you in person, but it's nice to see you virtually and to be in conversation like this. So I'll say in a very short version of my story that I grew up with a very strong Jewish identity, Jewish background, and also a very strong social justice identity, but didn't really bring the two together until I was in rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the late 90s and started getting involved in housing work in Harlem, in central Harlem. So it was about a 10-minute walk away from JTS, but felt like a different world, right? People at JTS would say, are you sure it's safe to go there? People in Harlem would say, wow, I've never met a Jew who's not a slumlord, right? Like it was just, everything was painful. And I started asking myself the question of, well, what does Judaism have to say about what's happening in housing right now? There was a particular moment in the late 90s when a lot of in-rem properties were being sold off to for-profit landlords and people were getting moved around and evicted. And I very quickly found myself in a chapter of Talmud that dealt with questions about when can you evict people? When are you not allowed to evict people? What repairs do landlords have to make? What repairs do tenants have to make, et cetera, et cetera. And found that some of the conversations that were happening in Harlem in the late 90s had been happening in Babylonia 1,500 years before. And I didn't know until that moment. And that led me on a journey to work in a few different Jewish social justice organizations, as well as to work in some secular social justice organizations while I was still a student. And ultimately to Trua 9 years ago. Trua organizes and trains a network of more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors, along with all of their communities. So we see rabbis and cantors as a lever to move their communities. So we reach hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews, if not more, to work on human rights issues, both here in North America, in the US and Canada, and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So half of our work is here and half of our work is there. And in our work, we work out of a deeply rooted Jewish tradition, which means that we're always looking to our Jewish heritage, our texts, our stories, our histories, thousands of years of wisdom that speak directly to what's happening now. And that is no less true now than ever before. I'll say that just as one last thing, a lot of times when people think about Judaism and what Jewish law is all about, what halakha is all about, people think about, what did I eat for breakfast? Was I allowed to eat that? What can I do on Shabbat? all of the ritual items. And those are really important. I want to say that really clearly. I'm a conservative rabbi. I'm a traditional Jew in my practice. And there's a whole area of Jewish law called Choshen Mishpat, which is all about how we're supposed to live together in society and how we build a just society that protects the dignity of every single person. And at Trua, we really try to live out all of that, to live an integrated Jewish life and to model what it means to be a Jew, to be a Jew in the world, to be rabbis, to be moral leaders, to be Jews in the world who are living not only the ritual practices, but also everything else, how we trying to build a society built on justice and dignity.
Hi, friends. Thank you, Chazon. Thank you, Nigel. Thanks for bringing us together. In many ways, what this has reminded me also, Chazon as a Jewish Lab for Sustainability. As long as I've been working for Chazon, the last 3.5 years or so, 4 years with my time at Friedman, I've noticed that, yes, as a Jewish Lab for Sustainability, we are focused on planetary sustainability, how our food choices and all of our choices interact with climate change and climate sustainability. But also, this conversation in particular is also a reminder that we also care about communal sustainability, the direction of the Jewish community, the trends and the things that we notice, and standing for what's right and what is just. And so it's just great that we're in this conversation. I know, Nigel, you've been having many of these Sunday morning after the plagues. So it's really just good to be here in discussion. And also Rabbi Jill. Rabbi Jill and I used to be neighbors. We used to live in Washington Heights together. I no longer live in Washington Heights, but it's an honor to be able to share this room and this time with you. And then also all of our friends that are tuning in, just like so amazing to see all of your faces and your names. And I just hope that we get a chance to be together soon, not in boxes, but actually just in person where the vibrations can be sensed. And even now, this is special that we could all get together, but we should all be blessed to be healthy, to be safe. And again, thank you for showing up this morning. Specifically for me, a little bit just my work with Chazon as Rabbi in Residence has really been thinking about how do we activate the Jewish community around one of the most pertinent issues of our generation, if not which is climate change. And I'll say that my background, I've always had in the back of my head the fact that just because of how I was raised and my ancestry and where I come from, that really my Torah, so to speak, my heartbeat, the thing that like pulls at my heartstrings more than anything is racial equality, just because that's my life. That's literally in my bones. It's my identity. And in fact, when I would be calling rabbis and spiritual leaders around the country, trying to activate them around climate change, I would say, some of them would say, well, in a certain way, I'm focusing on X, Y, and Z issue. Like I'm focusing on race this year. I'm focusing on gender equity. I'm focusing on, think of the other social pertinent issues, LGBTQ rights. We're focusing on all these different pieces that show up in the Jewish landscape. And I would say, but without planet Earth, we can't engage in those issues. And that's how I would bring that as a discussion. And today, I think that we recognize, and again, Chazon bringing this up, is that we have to respond to what's now and what's in front of us and what's urgent. And climate change is urgent, and we should be thinking about how we could activate around that. But we know that the time now, what it calls for us is to also stand against racial injustice in America. So I was born and raised in Muncie, New York. I come from a mixed race family. My entire life has been charged by race. I don't need to go into all the details here right now, but feel free to Google my name and then just read a few articles, and then, I would love to be in dialogue with you and think about how we all might be activated during this moment to respond, and what we might be able to do from where we're seated, and how I'm feeling right now. Nigel, you started with Shabbos. Honestly, if this conversation was happening on Thursday or Friday, I don't know if I would be in the same headspace. Personally, for me, I've been crying a lot. I've been sharing that pretty openly with people, which is not like my first thing to do. But partially because I've never felt more just myself, like where I'm just my whole self. Where people see my full background, and I've been interacting with people across the Jewish sphere, non-Jewish sphere, over the last week or two, and I feel the pain, I feel the concern, I feel the risk, and trying to find that middle place, that moderate voice that seems to be getting smaller and smaller. And so I'm excited to start my week with Chazon in this way, with this retreat. I'll be speaking about Shemitah a little later, and sustainability, not only through environment, but also through racial equity. That's a little later today. Hopefully we could hear, but just anyway, I'm grateful to start my week with and to have this discussion. And thank you again.
So I've been thinking recently about this notion in the Torah of a tza'akah, of the Jewish people crying out. And the Midrash is they're in Israel, they're in Egypt for 400 years. And essentially for like 398 years, nothing happens, right? They've been oppressed, but somehow or other they're soaking it up. And at a certain point, there is a great crying out. And somehow or other, that's a fulcrum to Exodus from Egypt. And I feel like this country right now is involved in a great crying out. And I'm really interested to hear from you, as we've watched even the art within the last 10 days. What's the relationship between feeling depressed and feeling angry? What's the relationship between how you are personally and what you're trying to do professionally? And in what ways is this, like, can this be a really good tza'akah, like that this can help this country be a better country? Do you see that? Is that possible? What needs to happen? Thoughts and comments. And also within that, I think part of that is that I think one of the things that I feel that I'm understanding is that it's not just about affecting change in society. It's almost about people's needs to stand up and say, this is totally wrong. What has happened is totally wrong. This and this and this and this is totally wrong. And it's actually not just about decisions or legislation. It's actually literally about the value within a society of those voices being raised and being heard. Thoughts, comments?
Yeah, it's great imagery. I mean, contextualizing, I think, everything going on in society through the Exodus is something that our rabbis have noted. Calling the rabbinic name for this second book of the Torah, Shemot, Exodus, is called Sefer HaGeula, the Book of Redemption. And Nachmanides, in his introduction to the book, he says, because it's really a blueprint for all redemptions, for all revolutions, for all, how do you say plural exodus? Is exodi? No, anyway. And so thinking about when they cried out, it says Vayitzaku, right? They cried out to Hashem, and it was only then when really the Exodus and the movement began to take form. Also, just another point on that note is we know that in many ways, the country, as the language that is being used, is that America is burning. That idea and the rupture of protests around the country began on Shavuot. It began like literally on like a holiday. I mean, you may say that Pesach is a holiday of freedom, but if there's like a holiday that like represents like civil, like, engagement and, caring about the stranger and the reminder that it could be codified into like citizenship and constitutional justice and law, like it's Shavuot. And we see this explosion take place on this holiday. And so if you think about like the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, right? So Exodus 22, as more laws have been given after the 10 Commandments, there's one line that I've been thinking about. Been quoting. So first it says, "V'ger lo toneh," this is the law for how we are supposed to be conscientious. There's two different laws, there's lo toneh and there's avat. There's different laws that describe how we are supposed to interact with the stranger or those who are being oppressed. Why? Because you know what that pain feels like, because you kigerim hayisem be'eretz Mitzrayim, and then it says for the stranger, for the orphan and the widow. And then here's the line, Nigel, and that's why I love this question. And if this person is being mistreated, or these people, and they cry out to me, they scream out to me, Shemo eshemat sakaso, I will surely hear their cry. That's what God says post-Exodus, like post-10 Commandments. And like that's in the context of receiving the Torah, of like being like, of holding a legacy of like, what does it mean to stand for justice? Like it's literally in our bedrock text of Judaism that if by the way, orphans and widows, if you really think about it, right? Every single Black person who came to this country through the African slave trade were orphans and widows. They were stolen away. They're all orphans and widows, and they've been crying out for hundreds of years. And I've been saying this, if you're just tuning in, welcome, welcome. But these people have been screaming, full volume, high level, hundreds of years. Welcome. Don't be afraid. Stay in the conversation. But the cry out, it's such a real cry out. I just wanted to respond to that. And I think there's other pieces to be shared. One other thing that I wanted to highlight, and I would love Rabbi Jill, if you, you're so sweet, Cheryl, thank you. Thank you for your comments. One thing, Rabbi Jill, I would love also just to bring up, I was speaking with Rabbi Menachem Creditor, who is the rabbi in residence of UJA, and before Shabbat, I was saying how the movement needs Shabbos. You know, we need rest. Like the movement, like it's true. It's so true that how could we put anything to rest when it comes to the pain of others and when people are dying? And we know that like if someone is dying right in front of us, Shabbat is like Tuesday, right? It's you know, it's no longer Shabbos in a way, right? If it's Saturday and someone in front of you is dying, and how that applies halacha l'maisa, practical application of Jewish law, that's not a part of this conversation, but at least in ethos, like just to keep that in mind. But the Shabbos voice, and I know, Rabbi Jill, I think you wrote at some point something about maybe not protesting on Shabbos or what that looks like or not. And again, I would love to hear what your lens is on that. And it just goes back to Shemitah. And this is my last thing. One thing that I've noticed through my learning of Shemitah through Chazon, as Chazon really believes that we need to put Shemitah on the map for our Jewish community, just the way any other holiday is on the Jewish map, the Shemitah year should be on our calendar. We should be thinking about how the Shemitah cycle really interacts with us. And one thing that's super unique about Shemitah is that it basically prescribes for us that in society, there needs to be rest. There's sanctioned rest where if someone is a slave, they're forced into slavery, at the 50th year, they have to go free. So in a way, through ethos, again, maybe how it applies in the land of Israel, not in the land of Israel, but at the very least, and we'll talk about this later today, but at the very least, what the Jubilee year signifies is that slavery couldn't have happened if we had that intact on some level. This idea that it should have never gotten this far, that society has said that no one should be ruling over anyone else. And that Shabbos is Shabbos for a reason. So I just wonder, how do we incorporate that? And I just, and thank you. Yeah, Dibarti.
Thank you so much. I want to actually go back to the Exodus verse that you shared, because I just also think that is just the most amazing, not only the verse, but the timing, right? Like we just got out of Mitzrayim. We're totally, it would be okay to be completely focused inward at this moment that we're just out of Mitzrayim, right? And that's a moment that God is like, okay, I know that you want to focus inward right now, but actually I'm going to focus you back outward. And it's totally counterintuitive that at that moment, God's like, by the way, you might in the future be in a place of power, and this is how you have to respond to the people who are not in that place of power. And there's actually, there's a comment by the Ramban, Nachmanides, on that says straight up, I'm not going to quote this exactly, but he says that God responded to the Jewish people because they were oppressed, and it wasn't because of their zchut, it wasn't because of their merit, because of anything they did. Like it wasn't God, according to Ramban, God is saying to the Israelites, I didn't respond because you're so great. I responded because you were oppressed and because you were crying out to me. And it's just out of mercy. And there's also a veiled threat, I think, there, maybe not such a veiled threat, that if there's ever a situation where it's somebody else crying out because we're the oppressors, that God is going to hear that voice. And so just that reminder always that God is listening to those who are crying out. And yeah, sometimes the cries have been happening for a very long time. And that's actually a transition to talking about Shabbat, because something that is really important to remember about this moment, this is a historic moment, and it's a really crucial moment. And I'm very much hoping that this is the beginning of a new era in our history. And this is not a short-term battle. I think for many of us, it feels like there's a lot of pressure to be out on the street right now. And I know many of us are grappling with questions of physical health and being on the street and all of those kinds of questions. And part of that pressure is because it feels like if I'm not out on the street right now, then I'm not doing anything, which first of all, doesn't have to be true. There's a lot that we can do, whether it's about calling our elected officials around particular legislation in each of our states, whether it's about donating money to bail funds, to Black-led organizations, right? There's a lot that we can do however we choose to participate. And also, the goal is to be in it for the long run, not just to go out with our nice sign and say, okay, I protested and like, you know, check, and now I can go and move on with my life. It's really about thinking about how we're going to commit in our lives, both to making our own communities anti-racist communities, whatever kind of communities those are, whether they're synagogues or schools or whatever communities we participate in, and what kinds of advocacy we're going to commit to in the long term, how we're going to spend our money, all of the long-term decisions. Not to say that one shouldn't go out and protest, but to remember that it's part of a much longer chain. And so for Shabbat, I want to be very careful when I say this, because people make their own decisions about Shabbat, and I don't want to suggest that if your decision was to be in the street yesterday or to be in the street next week, that's not the right decision. It's the right decision for you. I'll say what my decision is personally is not to protest on Shabbat for a few different reasons. One has to do with the kinds of activities that are traditionally prohibited on Shabbat, things like carrying money and taking transportation. So often protesting, I'm not saying requires, but sometimes you need to get on some kind of transportation to get somewhere, you need to take your keys. Now there's often ways to get around that. And I know many people who go through who jump through many hoops to make sure that they're not violating any of those prohibitions to be able to protest on Shabbat. But the other piece is twofold. One is that Shabbat is considered Mein Olam Haba, that it's a glimpse of the world to come. And it's a day when we don't create or destroy anything. This is when I talk to my kids about Shabbat and they want to know, like, why can't I draw? That's not work. Okay, work is not really the right translation that we're looking for. It's about leaving our world the way that it is, right? Just like God at the end of the sixth day, God wasn't done creating, and yet God paused. So that we also on the seventh day pause and don't change anything about the world around us, and instead try to catch a glimpse for a moment, inside our head of what the world could look like. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is that sometimes that sense of like, oh my God, I have to go to this protest that is on Shabbat or else I won't have done anything. There's a kind of hubris there. If I go out to this one protest on this one day, then I will fix everything, or that's the most important thing right now. And Shabbat actually reminds us that it's the 6 days, right? Not just the 6 days, but the 6 days times 52 weeks a year times, God willing, many, many years of our lives. And that we need that space sometimes to step back and to get the strength that we need to go back into it for the other 6 days.
It's just such an interesting threading of perspectives, and really, so I just appreciate it.
Well, I want to pick up this frame and take it in a slightly different direction. One of the things that Chazon has always been interested in as an organization is really genuinely the relationship between Jewish tradition and the wider world. To some extent, we're actually not interested in Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake. We're actually interested in how does this tradition help me understand and engage freshly with the world today, now this year, and how does what's really going on in the world help me understand the tradition freshly. And we've just now been talking about the Tzedakah, and we've been talking about Exodus, we've been talking about Shabbat. But I want to talk a little bit about Tshuva. We haven't, I think, in the demonstrations and what's happened in the last 10 days, heard much in the conversations about reparations and all that kind of stuff. But I actually feel as though Tshuva in Jewish tradition is an incredibly strong frame, because as I understand it, Tshuva involves repentance, involves both acknowledging that one has done something wrong and trying to figure out the people whom one has wronged, and trying to figure out how to make recompense to them, and committing not to do that kind of wrong going forwards. And I think I want to ask you, to what extent do you think that Tshuva is a useful frame for the conversation about race in this country, for legislation around race in this country, for the relationship between sort of practical things and on the one hand, or emotional or psychological things on the other hand. Thoughts, comments?
Oh, wow. Trauma is kind of where I would start. Not to capital T, lowercase t, everything in between, but in a way, who teaches us? Who teaches us to be racist? How do we inherit this voice that somehow, that Amy Cooper, that woman in Central Park? How do we inherit this idea that somehow if someone is actually dark skinned, and again for me, just from my background, just to name it, my father was a Baal Tshuva, became Chabad, was raised secular, and married my mother, in 1979, 1980, something like that. And my mother is biracial. Her mother side fought in the American Revolutionary War. Nicholas Gibbs, I'm a son of the American Revolution. And her father's side were slaves in America, Charles McGruder and Rachel Hill in Alabama. So my upbringing, knowing while growing up in Muncie that my family were slaves in America, and having the contrast to the rest of my family as someone who passes for white, to really understand as in a front row seat how our communities experience racism. So much of it is inherited. And I inherited my story, and so I have to bring it forward for this generation. And you're inheriting your story, and so much of what you need to try to bring forward for this generation. But specifically, how we inherit trauma from previous generations. It's interesting. Like, I forget who it was, but one of the people who was liberated from the death camps during the Holocaust, when the Americans came in a tank and broke down some of these doors of the concentration camps with their tanks and came in, there were some of these Polish Jews or whoever who had literally never seen a black person in their life. And when those black people were rising out of the tanks, breaking down the doors of their camps, there's this famous quote, and I wish I had it offhand, of a survivor saying, "I saw that black person, and I noted that I never saw a black person in my life, and I literally thought he was an angel." And that outlook and perspective is how did we inherit this mess? That we're so, and it's messy. It's really hard, but how could it be that we're even resistant to naming it as a human rights issue, that people of color in America for hundreds of years still don't have equity? And I'm in an echo chamber right now. I know all of you are with me. And I know that we have it. I know each of us are holding in different places, but I know that this is a human rights issue, So the tshuva piece, it's really hard because in order to really do teshuva, we need to have charata, they say, right? You need to have, regret, and you need to feel bad for something. But if we haven't contextualized our own story, it's hard for us to engage in that process. If we haven't thought that the things that maybe we are born into might have a problem, and some of us feel like we're the nachshon of our family. We're the first person to go into the water. The amount of people I've spoken to over the last week that have said, my parents are so racist. I had no idea my parents are so racist. I mean, chas v'shalom, God forbid it should be for any of us, but those really, that dynamic. So tshuva is a really to get to a place where we feel like we can engage in tshuva in a real way. And I think it's true, like Nigel, as we declared 5780 a year of environmental tshuva, chazon. I think to get there, it takes real work. It's not just tshuva is the Rambam was bold to codify how to approach tshuva, but we know that there are many things that could be said about tshuva and how we engage in this topic around tshuva. And my Rebbe, the person who has inspired me most in my life, and has led me to want to be a rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Weinberger. I was just in a class with him this morning, and he was saying about tshuva. And so, Nigel, I'm not directly answering your question because it's just so messy, to be honest. But he was just saying the deepest world is a world of tshuva. It is the most productive act we can do. I wrote this down this morning. It is the most fertile world. It is miraculous, where things all of a sudden can change. that's somehow what tshuva is. So we should be blessed. We should be blessed. I'll say this again, like, um, in many ways, the question of like what our this is where I'll land, where our grandchildren, what will our grandchildren, great grandchildren, what will our children's children say? Like, hey, Bubby, Zaidi, grandpa, grandma, grandparent, you know, when all this stuff was going on, like, what were you up to? Like, when this huge hurricane hit, whatever, and when there was a huge like natural disaster, where were you? Like, and when America was burning, quote unquote, and in this current administration, like, where were you? What were you up to? Right? Tshuva is action oriented. It's action oriented. So one thing I've shared in the past is if your ratio to talking versus action, if you're doing more talking than action right now, let's do some cheshbon. Let's take a step back. Let's look at what we're actually doing for the fight for racial equity in America, for the fight for human rights for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you
Follow that.
so much. Yeah, I also think that tshuva is a really important framework. And I think that it's important to think about what it would actually mean for us as a country to do tshuva. When we confess on Yom Kippur, we don't just confess for ourselves, we also confess for our ancestors, right? It's the standard language of the Machzor is to say, Anachnu bavotenu chatanu, that it's not just that we've done certain things, but also our ancestors. And I think that's really apt that many people in America today, often people will say, well, my family wasn't even here when there was slavery, or I personally never, et cetera, whatever it is. But of course, we're all part of this collective story of America. And we also have to do tshuva for everything that's happened during that collective story when we're still feeling that legacy of slavery and of racism and racial terror still today. So there is a huge tshuva project. And again, it's not just for whatever we personally have done, though that's also important, but also for what this country has done. And it's a tshuva process that is, not after the fact, right? The Talmud says that somebody who tries to do tshuva while they're still doing the sin is like somebody who's trying to go to the mikveh when they're holding a sheretz, like a creepy, crawly, impure thing, right? You can't purify yourself while you have something impure on you. And so there's both a process of, for ourselves, thinking about the ways in which, like Rabbi Rothstein said, that, many of us who present as white, who consider ourselves white, can't imagine ourselves being the person who would have killed George Floyd. But maybe some part of ourselves thinks, could I have been Amy Cooper, right? Like you said, like, is there an Amy Cooper in many or most white people? And so thinking about how it is that we do personal tshuva for that's part of the journey to anti-racism. And then also thinking about what it would mean for our country to do tshuva, which must mean some kind of reparations. But that's a whole question that many very smart people are thinking about what reparations would actually look like.
Yeah, and I think I just want to add that one of the things that I found myself thinking about just this last week, which I hadn't thought about for a long time, was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa after Mandela became president. And I think one of the things that's interesting when one starts to think about tshuva in a political context is that I think that it's actually, to me, it seems clear that this country needs two things, and each one of them is difficult, but each one by itself is insufficient. That on the one hand, it needs action, legislation, money, changes in policy, policing, incarceration, a whole series of things over there that are to do with legislation and policy, companies, organizations, nonprofits, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all that kind of stuff on the one hand. And somehow or other, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of like unpacked evil. Like it just unpacked it within the society. And it let South Africans, black and white, hear that, own it, grieve it, feel appalled by it, feel angry, but somehow or other like got it out. And I feel as though, in a way, somehow or other, this country has lacked both of those things. It's not just that we have, as it were, systematic racism, and it plays through in all sorts of ways, including in COVID, including in all of the early period of this. Like when we talk about environmental action, it's because we don't have clean air that poor people and communities of color have had higher asthma rates, and it's partly because they've had higher asthma rates that more people have died from COVID. So the pieces are interconnected, and I think I ask it particularly because it's going to be, I mean, as we all know, Chazon is a 501c3, we're not a party political organization, but nevertheless, it seems in one sense kind of hard to imagine things radically getting better while this president is in the White House. And so the question is, how do we create pathways both to sort of like policy change within the society, but also within the Jewish community and organizations, and also somehow or other a healthier emotional conversation? I realize that's an impossible thing to say, but I look to each of you as just wise, like, thoughts and comments on how either how you put those pieces together for yourselves personally, or as Jewish communal leaders, which to some extent we all are, how you think we should be balancing those two elements of this, as it were, the sort of practical and the psychological.
I guess I'm not sure if I'm going to answer that question, but I just want to say, to go back again to what I said before, this is a long-term project. This is like 400 years in the making. This is not about Donald Trump, though he certainly exacerbated the situation and said what unfortunately many people were thinking out loud. And just, and so just want to be, one of my worries, I mean, Trua is also a 501c3 organization, so I won't say anything about the election, but I do have a concern that if we have a new administration, that some people will say, okay, done, you know, like we can go back to our lives. That last 4 years was really hard, and now everything is normal again. And first of all, we didn't like the old normal. It wasn't just. And to remind ourselves that things didn't get better because we had a Black president for 8 years. I mean, better than it is now, for sure. But just to remind ourselves that nothing is going to be fixed in November or January, that this is a system that has been a racially unjust system that's been in place since the beginning of slavery 400 years ago. And we're not going to fix it in the next 4 or 5 months.
I actually just, all I really want to do is just echo what Rabbi Jill just shared and say it just in my own words, but literally just everything this similarly is one long haul. Like, where are we going to be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Like, how many rabbis and spiritual leaders in the country, and this is a call, by the way, how many rabbis and spiritual leaders in the country will be making sure that their sermons have to do with racial justice for this country? I'm curious, how many people, you know, as things open and we're not as at home and we're not as glued to the screens, the long haul, right? Are we truly in it for the long haul? And then also another point that Rabbi Jill made, contextualizing this moment. This is not just because of Trump's America, right? This is a long project, as Rabbi Jill said. This is something that's been going on for hundreds of years. And so for me, when I say that, I think contextualizing it specifically in American history, specifically in Black American history, specifically in Jewish Black American history, specifically in that context is super important for me. And I actually don't like, and maybe it's because I'm a purist in this way, comparing ever to any other societal complex country context issue in another place. So for an example, like the plight of other peoples in other countries have to do with different variables. We could harvest lessons. I believe in harvesting lessons from the plight of people in other countries, and maybe even seeing racism in South Africa or whatever it might be in an apartheid country and all of that. What that might mean, I think we could learn lessons, but I don't think it's valuable or helpful to the cause and the movement in America to compare like two different worlds and countries. In America, we must contextualize American Black history and the African slave trade in America, understand this country, this place, and how we as American citizens, when you use that passport And that logo of the US, do you know what that's also part of? That's also a part of the 1850s when there were 21 million legal slaves in America. I don't know if you know that your logo represents that. If you're not an American citizen, America's a beautiful country. It is the first place where Jews have had certain form of security that we've never had before in Jewish history. My mother, as a brown woman in Muncie, New York, wearing a sheitel, whose best friends, many of are Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews who live right around the corner from us, who we spent our whole life. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Muncie. My whole life was there. My parents still live in Muncie right now, right? The idea of Jews giving up their privilege after going through the history that we've been through as Jews, and to say that we need to give up our power is a scary thought. We have been, as a Jewish community, we've been through a lot. That's what my mother's saying, right? As a convert to Judaism, that's what she sees that in her friends. It's a scary thing to ask for. But guess what? Another piece of it is that if we actually remember our history, if we remember the context of how we got to America, if we remember what it says on the Statue of Liberty, right, about give me your tired, you're hungry, and all the things that we've been through to get here, if we remember what this American promise and dream was supposed to be about, then we would also be able to note that, by contextualizing the moment, we would act. By knowing our own history, by knowing what this country is supposed to be representing, we could act through that lens. So anyway, so much.
To both of you, I want to say thank you. We're getting very close to wrapping up. I think I want to ask you, almost in closing, two different sorts of things, and in a way, sort of final comments. One of them is advice, which could be loving advice. It could be tochacha, which is like a form of rebuke, but assuming people of goodwill, listening to you now and subsequently in other recordings, here are one or two or three things that anybody watching or listening to this could or should be thinking about. One question. And I think the second question is, just share something that gives you a sense of hope, something that within all of this, it's been a very hard, upsetting, distressing period in so many different ways. And within that, I actually do think that I feel a kernel of positive change in this country. And I'm just interested for each of you to know, what is the thing within this that gives you a sense of hope and sustenance. So, Reb Jill.
Thank you so much. So in the first question, I would say that for everybody, I don't know everybody in the call, so many of you are already doing this, but I would say that two things that we all can do. One is to learn and to listen. So whether that's reading or watching movies or listening to the voices of the many Black people and people of color who are writing. Right now, there's 1 million bibliographies out there of anti-racist reading group lists, so you can just Google. I don't have to run through it, but just to do our own work, and also within whatever communities that we might be a part of. And the second is to get involved in something, and really anything. Like whether it's making a commitment that I'm going to give a certain percentage of my tzedakah every year to organizations that are working on racial justice, and that's going to be my action. I'm going to join this one organization locally, nationally, whatever it is, and get involved in this advocacy project. But something that, it doesn't have to be everything. It can't be everything. Just one thing that we can commit to doing for a while. Like, I'm going to work on this advocacy project until the bill passes. I'm going to donate at least for the next year to these couple of organizations, and hopefully the following year as well. Right. So thinking about what it is that we can really commit to long term. And what gives me hope is the fact that people are out in the streets. I mean, that also makes me very anxious in terms of the health issues, but really it gives me hope that so many people are out in the streets, including perhaps people who haven't ever protested before, that people who have never talked about racial justice are having those conversations on social media with their friends, with their families, within their communities, inside their own heads, however it's happening. And I do feel like there is an opening now for, God willing, some real work that will at least start that process of tshuva in America.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Rabbi Jill. So Rabbi Jill said, learn, listen, and do that in multiple ways. Get involved in something. That was another thing I heard. Just get involved in something. And then also thinking what your long-term commitment might be and how this is sustainable for you. I love those. Those are at least three of the things that I just heard from Rabbi Jill. So thank you. I think things that I would add specifically, I think through one thing is like, for me personally, I'm just one person, one opinion, right? And there are so many experts in the field. There are so many, as a Jew of color who passes for white, and people always asking, wait, but like you're white, or what does that mean for you? And yeah, it's complex. I'm so down. Let's talk about it. I've written a few articles on that. You could Google it. Like, it's a current thing. But what I would also say, this is just what I would say from where I'm sitting. So I'm sure there are people that have been fighting for racial justice longer than I have, that have been alive, that might say something different. And I think each of the different Jewish communal platforms and organizations have the ability to lift up the voices of people of color and fight for racial justice. And each of our platforms must look internally first with their staff, their leadership, their boards. We all can do something. We all can do something. Our statements without action are statements that I think fall short a little bit and miss a point, miss an important point about moving and how to move forward. So just like a few things that I would suggest, and like this is just a thought. Just agreeing that each of us have to find where we could engage and what level of intensity we could engage and where and how and I think that that's important, but we just must do something. But a few things is like, I would suggest every Jewish institution to seek out experts in the field to consult and advise them in moving the needle for racial justice in America through their specific institutions. I would create closed like cohorts of Jewish communal leaders, and I would want to like help them process their own hangups around race and racism and this moment so that they could really fight the good fight, for Black America and for all Americans. I'd also want to help leadership curate and tailor make conversations based on the context of their institution and community and help guide them to action steps for stronger racial justice engagement from their particular context, because each of us from our own stories, friends, from our own stories have to engage in this. We have to think about ourselves. So bottom line, we can't simply do nothing, There's this line from the rabbis, Kol mi she'efshar limchot al anshe beito. Anyone who sees in their own house that something is wrong and they're able to protest it, they're able to say that this is wrong, they should do it. But sometimes, and if that's where your control lies, it's only in your house. But sometimes your control, is like a few other families. You have a community, and sometimes your control is the whole city, and sometimes your control is you're in a place of power. And by power, I mean you have a platform. You have a platform. Like I was just on a video from Mayim Bialik. Like what an incredible thing. She has a huge platform, and she wants to raise voices of color, Jews of color. It's an incredible thing. How do we all how do we use what we have? And I just want to go back to what Carol shared, because she's so right. It's not about giving up our power. It's about sharing what we have. It's about saying, how do we use our platform to lift up your platform? That's what it's saying. You have, and I think so. So anyway, Dibarti on that. Yeah.
So I want a good place to end, because I want to say to both of you that on behalf of Chazon and Friedman, I think I'm very honored to have been able to offer this platform for the two of you to teach Torah in a deep way. I want to thank each and both of you, not only for being with us this last hour, but for the work that you do day in and day out. I want to wish you both chazak, chazak, v'nit chazak. May you be strengthened in doing this work. And I both Isabella Friedman and Chazon have always been part of overlapping ecosystems. And they're not just sort of literal physical ecosystems, they're existential ecosystems, and they include ecosystems of organizations, communities, different streams within Jewish life. And I hope and I pray that together, we all of us, including Chazon and including Friedman, are part of helping genuinely to create a better America, a better world, and a more just one. And I want to thank Rabbi Jill Jacobs, I want to thank Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, and I want to say, I look forward to seeing you, some of you later on today. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Bye.
Thank you.